Hello, I'm Dr. Palumbo. Welcome. In this short video, we're going to take a look at factory overhead allocation. Now, you should remember from earlier studies that we have three costs of a finished product. We've got our raw material, or it can also be called direct material. We've got direct labor, and we have factory overhead. Okay? So what happens, what's going to happen is, let's put up our factory here. What's going to happen is this direct material comes into the factory, and then inside of there our conversion process begins. Labor is being added, and labor is making it into a finished product. At the same time, we're also incurring factory overhead. When that comes out the factory as a finished product, it goes into our finished goods warehouse or directly to the customer, if it's a special order kind of thing. And it's carrying those three costs of material, labor, and factory overhead. Now, by using the term direct for direct materials and direct labor, that tells us that we have no problem tracing those. Let's say I'm making wood furniture. We'll use that as our example today. I know if I'm making a stool, a small stool for a child, I know exactly how much wood went into that stool, and I know exactly how long it took me to make it. If I made a desk, the same thing. I know how much wood went into that desk. I know how much time went into that desk. So the problem is this factory overhead, which by definition is an indirect cost. I can't trace it. There's that's really no way for me to tell how much factory overhead that one product has absorbed. And remember, factory overhead are all the costs of operating that factory. So we've got things like heat, light, power, supplies, indirect labor, the foreman, maintenance people, janitorial, the people who work in the raw materials and move the materials around. So there's lots of costs there. Depreciation if we own it, rent if we rent the factory, insurance on it. So how do I know how much overhead, how much of that did that one child's stool absorb? How much did that desk absorb? I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. So I'm left with an allocation. Okay? And we'll talk about allocations in a minute, that no allocation is truly accurate. So what I need to figure out then is two things. Now, by the way, if I only make one product, if I made nothing in this factory but stools for children, and they were all exactly the same, we could all go home now because we wouldn't have any problem. Okay? The problem comes up in the more types of products we make and the more diverse they are, the more trouble we have with our allocation of factory overhead. So I have two problems. One is how much did it absorb, and the second problem I have is I need to know now. I can't wait until the end of the year, and I'll tell you why. Let's say we make this furniture, and Mrs. Smith comes in and says, I want to have a custom-made desk for my husband. I want it by February 14th for Valentine's Day. I'm going to surprise him with a nice Valentine's Day gift. When we finish that desk and we ship it to Mrs. Smith, we collect that money from her. We have a sale. We also need to know what is our cost of goods sold. How much did it cost us to make that desk? That's why it's important that we have it now. So what we're stuck with then is coming up with what we call a predetermined factory overhead rate. Now, how do we know how much the stool did? How do we know how much that desk did? Well, somebody came up with the thought, not me, it's been around for a long time, came up with the thinking that if it takes us 1 hour to make a stool and it takes us 5 hours to make a bookcase, for example, that the bookcase has been in the factory for 5 hours longer than the stool, right? 1 hour for a stool, 5 hours to the bookcase has been in the factory for 5 times as long, therefore it should have used up 5 times as much factory overhead, or absorbed 5 times as much factory overhead. Now, of course, we don't know that as an exact science, but it's a good starting point. So what we're going to do then is two things. The first thing we're going to do is come up with a budgeted sloppy there, I apologize. A budget factory overhead. Let's say $1 million in our factory. Okay. And then we're going to come up with some activity base. And how do we know that the stool has been in there for 1 hour and the desk has been in there for 5 hours? Well, we're going to base it on direct labor hours. How long did it take us? If it took us an hour to make the stool, it's been in the factory for an hour. If it's 5 hours, so that's the way we're going to work it. So we're going to divide that by some activity, okay? And I'm going to use direct labor hours. All right. Now, somebody might say, well, wait a minute. We have both skilled carpenters, or cabinet makers, furniture makers. We have unskilled workers. People who just do nothing but sand it and stain it, but they're working on a product. There are direct labor. So maybe it's not how many hours it's been in, but what kind of people were working on it. So I could use also something I could use direct labor cost. Right? So if there was more cabinet maker time put in and wages of cabinet makers versus unskilled workers who are just sanding, something like that, that might make some sense. Somebody may say, well, wait a minute, it's really not labor, it's how much raw material do we use? That desk uses a lot more raw materials than the stool, so I can use raw materials units. And somebody could say, well, it's really not the units as much as it is the cost. It's much harder to work with higher priced woods, mahoganies and cherries and oaks, than it is with the lower end wood like pine. So somebody may say, well, no, really, maybe it should be raw material dollars. Well, that's fine. Okay. Also, if we're a highly mechanized operation where we're not using that much people, but we're using more machineries, I could use something like machine hours. Okay. So let's say I use direct labor hours. Right? So now I need to know what budgeted activities. I have to do this at the beginning of the year. So let's say I estimate 40,000 hours. Okay. So what I do then, I divide 40,000 into $1 million. This is the direct labor hours. And I come up with my rate. And I'm going backwards here, but that's okay. So 40 into there, it should be $25 per hour. So I hope that works out. I don't have my calculator with me. I'm just doing this off the top of my head. All right, so then what happens, once that job is completed, we have a job ticket, and the job ticket says, here's how much raw material went in there, here's how much factory overhead went in there, how much direct labor went in there. And I take a look at it, and I say, oh, let's see, that desk used 5 hours of direct labor, so that should have taken, should be charged with $125 of factory overhead. Okay? And then out the door it goes. So I know my exact raw material cost. I know my exact direct labor cost. I've now estimated that $125 of factory overhead must have been absorbed. Okay? In a perfect world, what would happen at the end of the year? We would have had $1 million in our general ledger for factory overhead. We would have worked 40,000 hours. That's approximately 20 people working all year long. But stuff happens. Cold winter, we use more heating. We have sick time, vacation time. Somebody quits. So nothing ever works out. We'll talk about that in a minute. How we how we deal with it if we miscalculated this whole thing at the end of the year. Okay? But that's basically the way it works. Now, if you're taking this budgeted factory overhead is in dollars, right? If I was using direct labor dollars, if I'm doing direct labor dollars into direct factory overhead dollars into dollars, my answer would come out as a percentage. Same thing with raw material costs, my answer would come up as a percentage. All right? So here, it would be 250 times the, or 250%, 25 times. Okay? I think I got that right. So just remember, if you're doing dollars into dollars, you're going to end up with an answer that comes up in as a percentage. When you're doing units, it'll be a dollar amount per unit. Now, that works out okay. That's the way we started out. And then we can take this one step further and say, wait a minute, what happens if a different department? So let's say we make furniture, wood furniture, and we make finished furniture and unfinished furniture. And they have these stores that sell unfinished furniture. So what happens is, let's take our factory again. And I've got 4 different departments in that factory. And what happens is, it comes in, and over here we do the woodwork, where we cut the wood, okay? Then it comes over to here, okay, where it's we do the paint, or the finish, I should say. Then they don't have to paint. Well, we could have some furniture painted. We could have some that's done like that. Then it comes over here to assembly. And then it, excuse me, choking my mouth. It comes over here to packaging. So it comes in over here, we do all the woodworking on it, goes over here, goes to the finishing department where it's painted or stained, whatever it's done to it. Comes down here to the assembly department, and then comes over here where it's being packed. Now, the problem is, if I had one plant-wide rate, and that's what we did earlier, we had one rate for the entire factory, that's plant-wide rate. If I have unfinished furniture, what's happening with the unfinished furniture is it's coming in, the raw materials come into the factory, we do our woodworking on it, but it does not go to the paint department. It goes right to assembly, and then from assembly over here. So the problem we have is if I'm charging that unfinished furniture with part of the paint department's cost, what's happening here is I'm adding too much cost to the unfinished furniture and not enough cost to the unfinished furniture. Excuse me, the finished furniture. So we run into that problem, and in accounting, if we start overcosting or undercosting a product, then we end up overpricing or underpricing a product, then we end up losing money, or we have a lot of customers, they're buying a lot of stuff, but we're not charging enough, so we're losing money, or we're charging too much and the customers go elsewhere. So it's important that we get the as accurate costing as we can. Now the last thing, so this is the departmental, so what I do then is I need to come up with woodworking. They're going to have a rate, and maybe that's based on machine hours, okay? Maybe over here it might be done on the raw material. Okay, how much raw materials are put in? The more raw materials, the more factory overhead it's absorbed. Or it could be labor. Okay, assembly again could be direct labor hours. Okay, packing might be units or direct labor hours. But what I end up doing is I'm going to have 4 different overhead rates. Now, one thing you have to remember I said I had $1 million of factory overhead in my example. Okay. That doesn't change. The $1 million does not change. When I'm all done with these 4 departments, I'm still going to have $1 million. All right? So that's important to remember. But now what I look at is I look at a piece of furniture that came through and I say, okay, did it have woodworking? Fine. Then it needs to pick up part of the cost of the woodworking. Okay. And we said that might be machine hours. Did it go to the paint department? Well, the unfinished, no, so it doesn't pick up any of the overhead of the paint department. Assembly, yes, maybe. Not everything is assembled. Sometimes we can make furniture that's just broken down. You have to assemble it yourself, like IKEA. And then the packing, everything gets packed, okay, to be shipped. So there we've taken it a step further and we said instead of having one overhead rate, let's come up with 4 separate ones. Now, very briefly, that's a lecture for a whole other time, is I want to talk very quickly about activity-based costing here. And back to our factory. ABC based costing says, wait a minute, the fact that that stool was in the factory for an hour doesn't mean that it's used, or the desk is in there for 5 times as long. Doesn't mean that the desk is used 5 times as much overhead. It's really these activities that it's undergone that causes the overhead to happen. So for example, we have an engineering department. The engineering department makes changes to products as they're coming out. Maybe we get complaints that the edges are too sharp. We need to round off the edges or something like that. So they make an engineering change. Now, if we're doing something like a podium, you've all been in a classroom, you've all seen a professor in front of a podium. Those podiums really haven't changed a whole lot since the dawn of man. They were using the same podiums. But if you're talking about something like a computer, imagine how many engineering changes go into computers. So if I'm making wood products and I'm making podiums, there's probably not much chance I need an engineering department to make a lot of changes. But if I'm making some kind of desk or a cart to move around electronic stuff, as electronics are changing in nature from the big clunky computers to tablets or phones like that, there's a difference in what needs to be done. So what they said is instead of coming up with departments, this, that, and this other, I'm going to have a whole series of activities. Okay? Now what might they be? Engineering changes, material handling, setup. Every time I set up this equipment I need to have a setup charge, quality control, inspections, things like that. And activity-based costing, I may have 25 of these. Okay. So I end up in activity-based costing, and we're not going to go through the examples in this short video. We'll do that at another time. I just wanted to make you aware of it when you're talking about allocations. So I may end up having 25 different activities, and I add up the cost, like the purchasing department. I add up the cost of the purchasing department. Again, I divide it by my budgeted number of purchase orders, and then I say, okay, how much does it cost me to generate a purchase order? Now, some things, like the podium, we might just put 2 or 3 in a year for wood, where something like, if I was building a transmission, I'd have a lot of different purchase orders. Okay? We'll talk about that later on. The last thing I did want to talk about is what happens at the end of the year when I've done all of this and I've charged out all my products, and I know from my general ledger, I know how much has been applied. And that applied factory overhead is nothing more than how much has been charged to the jobs that went to the factory today, or this period, this year, month, week, whatever. And then I'm going to look at the actual factory overhead, and I may be over or under applied. Hopefully hopefully I didn't blow it so bad that this is a huge number. It should be a small number in comparison to what's going on. But if I find out, I had this $1 million I thought it was going to have $1 million of factory overhead, but I ended up only, coming up with 999,000. So I'm over applied by 1,000. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that under or over applied factory overhead, and I will dump it into cost of goods manufactured and get rid of it. Okay. If it's a big number, we'll allocate it, but that's not for our lesson today. But just know that this, at the end of the year, it's not perfect. We need to look and say, okay, what did we do? What should we have done? Any differences? Let's just dump them right into the cost of goods manufactured. Now, students will say, oh, we had that traditional method, one giant rate for the factory overhead. And then we did the departments, that's better, and then we did activity-based costing, and students will tell me, oh, activity-based costing, that's perfect. Now we have a perfect allocation. And the answer is, no, we do not. We don't have a perfect allocation. And the example I like to give in my classes is, let's say we had 8 people that go out for dinner. Well, I live here in the Southwest, so they go out for Mexican food. And it's quite easy if somebody says, "Oh, I'll have the taco dish, at $9.95." Fine, you owe us $9.95 plus a tip, and taxes if there's any taxes. And you had the enchiladas, and you had the chimichanga plate. So very easy to figure that part out. But let's say the 80 you sit down and somebody says, "Let's order a couple appetizers for the table. Let's order a couple pitchers of drink." Okay. Soda, sangria, whatever. Now, how do you allocate? We know what your taco dinner costs. That's $9.95. That's what you owe us. But how much does that person owe us for the drinks? Well, we could take the appetizers and the drinks. We could divide by 8. That's fine. But what if somebody says, "I don't drink"? You ordered sangria. I don't drink alcohol. Like myself, I drink water. Why should that person have to pay? What if one person says, "Okay, I'll have 4 ounces of sangria." Another person, drinks the rest of the pitcher. How would you allocate that fairly? How about nachos? Are you going to sit there and say, "We had this plate. We estimated there was 52 nacho chips on the plate, and you ate 12 nacho chips, so therefore you owe us 12 over 52 times whatever that nachos cost us." You see, it gets very difficult. It's not precise. Okay, we could all chip in. If we all chipped in 1/8 for the drinks and the appetizers, fine. But that is not really what we used up. Now, if we go out and they start ordering, 5 pitchers of drinks, and I say, "Well, I don't drink. I'm just having water." I don't want to hear I owe 1/8 of those 5 pitchers of drinks. In accounting, and so I don't show up for dinner next time. In accounting, what happens? We misallocate the cost. We miscost our product. We start to misprice it, and once we misprice it, we start losing customers. I don't show up for lunch. Not a big deal. But if our customers don't show up, we're not going to stay in business very long. So you have to remember that no allocation is perfect. So remember, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take that factory overhead budget. That's a budgeted number, an estimated number. How much do we think we're going to have in overhead for the year? We are going to come up with a budget activity, and that activity has to be something that we can directly trace to the product. So it's usually raw materials or direct labor or machine hours, one of those 3. And then we're going to apply that as our jobs are done throughout the year, and we need to cost them out immediately. We'll use this predetermined rate. At the end of the year, we'll settle up. We'll say, okay, how much did we charge our products? How much should we have charged our products? Let's make that necessary adjustment and dump it into cost of goods sold. Also, when I don't have it here on the board anymore, but when I have activity-based costing, if I've got 25 different cost centers and cost drivers, again, remember, they're all going to add back up to that $1 million. We're still talking about the same $1 million, but do we do it in one rate? Do we do it in 4 rates? Do we do it in, I don't have 25 fingers and I don't want to take my shoes off, but do we do it in 25 different rates? So it doesn't matter. Okay? The thinking is the same. In theory, we're saying if we use more activity bases than one big rate, we should be more accurate, but again, we're never going to be perfect. So with that, I'll say goodbye and turn off the machine, and we will see you hopefully for our next video chat. Thanks for coming. Bye everyone.